Well, and you touch upon this, and I was just about to ask you about it. In an op-ed you wrote last year for the Washington Post, you quoted this Chinese citizen as saying, "Mao stole social idealism from us, and we have never regained it." And in general, you suggested in this article that many people in China have a very cynical view of their own government. I'm wondering whether the way that we interact in the West, particularly here in America, with China, has maybe given sort of the average citizen in China a cynical view of us as well.
No, I don't think so there. I don't think the average person in China knows that much about the U.S. policy managers in Washington. The ones in China who do know about the managers are the ones that correspond to them at the highest levels of the government. For ordinary people in China, what forms their view of their own government overwhelmingly is their own daily life experience. And the problems of corruption and pollution, especially air and water pollution, not so much global warming, that's sort of too way ahead of things for the ordinary Chinese person, but corruption and pollution and the growing wealth gap and bullying and repression by local leaders, these are the things that cause the negative feelings about the Communist Party inside China. The ordinary Chinese person usually harbors the hope that the top leadership inside China is going to be more enlightened, and if they can only get up to the top levels, they'll be okay. And they're most angry at the people that are right above them in the ruling bureaucracy. But that's what forms the opinions of people in China more than U.S. attitudes. The man that I quoted in that op-ed that you noted is not a typical Chinese. The people who came to that conference are sophisticated, high-level intellectuals. They're dissidents. They're not within the political elite that runs the country, but they're also not typical ordinary voices. This is a man who remembered the 1950s, and that conference about the 1950s was remembering how people like him as young people really threw themselves into the revolution with high hopes that we can have a new society that serves the people and so on. And then when the Maoist disasters came along in the late 50s and 60s, were disillusioned, and in his view, China has never recovered its idealism.
And one last question then. When the Olympics were set, when the International Olympic Committee said that they would have these Olympics this past summer in China, a lot of people suggested, well, this would be another step along the way to China, becoming a more liberal society, that it would force China to address human rights, etc. In retrospect, now since it's been a couple of months, what do you make of the Olympics? Did they really, have any of these effects, or was it more a show and tell for a couple of weeks and then back to normal?
I would say it was almost, in those terms, worse than a show and tell. Now, before I go further with that thought, let me say that your original speculation there is correct, and it's one that I shared going into the Olympics. I hoped that the arrival of the Olympics would knock loose the authoritarian nature of the system a bit. After all, we saw that happen when the Olympics came to South Korea, Seoul, in 1988. We also saw the Olympics have a sort of indirect effect when they went to Moscow, and even when they went to Hitler's Germany in 1936, Hitler wasn't around a decade later, not because of the Olympics, to be sure, but there were good reasons going into the Olympics to hope that it would have a liberalizing effect on the regime. The other side of that question, and I feared this too before the Olympics, is that the Communist Party would use the prestige of hosting the Olympics in order to stimulate nationalism inside China and to cause that nationalism to be associated with the party itself. One of the big projects of the Communist Party ever since the Tiananmen massacre, when its prestige was at an all-time low, has been to stimulate nationalism and to implant the idea in the Chinese populace that the way to be patriotic, to love your country, is to love the party and to love the leadership of the party. The Olympics was designed by the people running it to foster that impression, and I think it worked. I'm not happy that it worked, but I think it did. I think that a lot of Chinese who rightly are proud of their country and rightly want to be proud of staging an Olympics saw in the spectacular shows at the beginning and the end of the Olympics, as well as in the fact that China went away with the most gold medals. Not only pride in their country, but vindication or even exaltation, one might say, of the leadership of the Communist Party of China. And I think that's too bad, because over the last 50 years of history, if you ask what's the general scorecard for the Communist Party of China, it's a very mixed picture, and the downside of it is truly horrible. The greatest famine in the history of the world in the late 1950s, which even today you're not allowed to talk about in China or write about, and it's blank in school. I don't know if you watched the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, but the glorious history of China was charted through the dynasties down to 1949, when the Communist Revolution succeeded, and then blink, all of a sudden we come to the late 70s, the reform and opening and the modernization efforts. The whole very ugly disasters of late Maoism were completely skipped there, and they're skipped in museums and in textbooks. Can't talk about it. And the harm to the Chinese psyche and the value system of Chinese people from that body blow to the nation in the late Mao years is still there today. You're not allowed to have public discussions about moral, religious values other than to say you support the party and you make money. And money making has become the big new ideology along with nationalism. And these are two, they're okay. I'm not against money and I'm not against nations, but they're too thin morally. They just don't fit the broad humanistic tradition and deeper values that the Chinese culture has had for many, many centuries. And in those broad terms, the Communist Party of China really has not done a good job. And therefore, to exalt it as if it's the champion of everything, as the Olympics successfully did, is too bad. And so my score sheet on the result of the Olympics is more pessimistic than before we went into them. I think that, if I could have seen in advance what actually happened, I would have been leaning against the hosting of the Olympics in Beijing.
Professor Link, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.